Hello, this is part number 58, NSE4 preparation for the exam Fortinet. Network address translation. What is network address translation? It's a method that enables net devices such as firewall or router to translate or map the IP addresses in a packet to another IP address, usually for connectivity purpose. If port information in the packet also translated, then the translation method is called PAT, Port Address Translation. NET provides the following benefits. First, security. The real IP addresses of devices are hidden from external networks. Second, public address depletion prevention. Hundreds of computers can share the same public IPv4 addresses. Benefit number 3, private address flexibility. The addresses can stay the same even if internet service providers change. We can reuse private addresses in multiple networks. There are two types of network address translation. SNET, which is source network address translation, and DNET, destination network address translation. SNET is used to allow the internal host to connect with the internet, and DNET, destination network address translation, is used by external host to initiate connection with a private network. In source network address translation, a NET device translates the source IP address and source port in a packet. In DNET, network address translation devices translate the destination IP addresses and destination ports. We can configure FortiGate to perform SNET and DNET as follows. For SNET, we enable network address translation on the matching firewall policy. Alternatively, we can enable central NET to configure central SNET rules for the VDOM, virtual domain. For DNET, we configure virtual IPs, VIPs, and then reference them on the matching firewall policy. If we enable central NET, we configure central NET rules and VIP objects for DNET. For example, we configure the most common case is SNET. FortiGate is acting as a NET device. It translates private IP address assigned to the personal computer to the public addresses assigned to you by internet service provider. The private to public source address translation is needed for the personal computer to access the internet web server. NET64 and NET46, they are methods that translate IPv6 addresses to IPv4 addresses and the reverse, respectively. NET64 translates NET IPv6 to IPv4, and NET46 translates from IP version 4 to IP version 6. IPv6 networks with IPv4 networks using NET64 and 46, while NET66 consists of translating addresses between two IPv6 networks. We can configure network address translation using firewall policy NET mode or central NET. When we use firewall policy NET mode, we must configure SNET, source network address translation, and DNET for each firewall policy. When we use central network address translation, we configure NET per virtual domain by configuring SNET and DNET rules. The result is that SNET and DNET settings automatically apply to multiple firewall policies, as opposed to each firewall policy in firewall policy network address translation. And as a best practice, when we use central net, we should configure specific SNET and DNET rules so they match only the desired firewall policies in our configurations. Both firewall policy network address translation and central network address translation produce the same results. However, some deployment scenarios are best suited to firewall policy network address translation, and some are best suited to central network address translation. Firewall policy net is suggested for deployments that include relatively few network address translation IP addresses, and where each network address translation IP address would have separate policies and security profiles. Central NAT is suggested for more complex scenarios where multiple NAT IP addresses have identical policies and security profiles, or next generation firewall (NGFW) policy mode, where the appropriate policy may not be determined at the first packet. Questions.